The morning tasted like grief before Simone even opened her eyes. Not the sharp, sudden kind. She had already lived through that 11 days ago at 4:19 in the morning when the phone rang and the world reorganized itself around a single sentence from her father's physician. That grief had been immediate, volcanic, the kind that knocks you sideways and leaves you on the kitchen floor, not knowing how you got there. This morning was different. This was the settled weight of it, the grief that has moved in and unpacked and made itself at home in every room of you. She lay still for a moment, flat on her back, staring at the ceiling of a bedroom that felt several degrees colder than it had any right to be in June. Marcus's side of the bed was empty. She registered this the way you register something that has become, over time, was so common it no longer surprises you. It simply confirms a pattern your body understood before your mind caught up. The sheets on his side were undisturbed. He had not come home, or he had come home briefly and left again, or he had come home at some point in the night and slept on the couch because he knew what day this was and had made a private calculation about what that required of him. She had learned, in 4 years of marriage to Marcus Holt, to stop guessing at his calculations. They were always about Marcus. That was the only consistent variable. The funeral program was on the nightstand. She had printed it herself 2 nights ago, sitting at the desk in the study at midnight while the house was quiet and her father was 3 days gone. And she was the kind of busy that grief makes you when you are the only one handling things. She had chosen the photograph herself. Her father at 62, broad-shouldered, a smile that started in his eyes before it reached his mouth, wearing the blue linen shirt she had given him 2 Christmases ago. She had chosen the scripture herself, the one he used to read to her when she was small, his voice making the words sound like something personal between him and God. She had designed the layout herself, the same way she had designed everything in her life that mattered, with care, with precision, with the patience of a woman who had been taught that attention is a form of love. She sat up, reached for the program, held it with both hands. Her hands were trembling. She noticed this and pressed her fingers together, and the trembling didn't stop, so she let it. Let it move up through her wrists and into her arms, and she sat there on the edge of the bed in the black dress she had already put on. She had dressed at 5 a.m. because sleep had stopped being available around 4:30, and she let herself tremble. Let herself be, for just these private minutes, only a daughter, not a wife, not an executive, not the woman who managed everything quietly and completely. Just a daughter whose father was gone and who had his voice memorized, and who would spend the rest of her life reaching for the phone before remembering. She touched the bracelet on her left wrist. Thin gold, plain, old. The engraving on the inside of the band had been worn smooth at the edges from years of her thumb finding it without being asked. 4 words. Still water runs deep. Her father had clasped it on her wrist when she was 11 years old, on the porch of their Atlanta home, on the kind of summer morning that stays in your memory as a specific quality of light. He had told her it belonged to his grandmother, a woman named Celestine, who had survived things he still couldn't say plainly, but could say around. The way you talk around the center of a hard thing when the center is too heavy to lift directly. He told her Celestine had worn it through all of it without breaking. He told her the bracelet went to the one in the family who carried the most without saying so. Simone had been 11. She had looked at it on her wrist and felt the weight of it, which was both the weight of gold and the weight of being seen accurately by your father. She stood up, smoothed the front of her black dress, picked up her keys from the dresser, walked to the front door, opened it, stepped out into the morning, and stopped. Marcus's car was parked directly behind hers in the driveway, not to the side, not angled, directly behind, bumper close to bumper, blocking her completely and without ambiguity. The car was cold. The engine was off. It had been sitting there long enough to gather the particular stillness of something that was placed deliberately and left. She stood in the doorway for a long moment with the morning air on her face and the funeral program in her right hand. She looked at the car the way you look at something your mind understands but your chest refuses to confirm. Then she went back inside and moved through the house calling Marcus's name, and her own voice came back to her empty from every room, and on end she already knew he wasn't there. She called his cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His recorded voice was smooth and warm and reminded her of who she had thought he was at 29 when he walked into the restaurant she managed and asked for her by name and listened to her speak for an entire evening, like she was the only person in the room worth hearing. She called again. He picked up on the third ring. The background behind him was warm with low music and the soft clatter of a kitchen that was not theirs. His voice was loose. He said he'd move the car when he got back. She asked where he was. The pause that followed was not the pause of a man who was confused or caught off guard. It was the pause of a man deciding how much of the truth to use as a placeholder for the rest of it. He said he was handling something important. His voice did not change when he said it. That was the part she felt most. Not what he said, but the unchanged quality of his voice. The steadiness of a man who had decided that this moment did not require him to be anything different than he currently was. She asked him once more, gently and plainly, if he could come move the car. He said he'd be back later. The line went quiet. She set the phone on the small table near the door. She looked at the funeral program in her hand, at her father's face in the photograph, at the scripture along the bottom. She pressed her fingers into the paper until it creased. Then Marcus's mother called. Gloria Holt had a voice like something that had been polished and narrowed over many years of managing information. She never led with condolences. She called to ask Simone whether she was planning to make a scene, whether she had thought about how things looked, whether she understood that her behavior would reflect on the family. She delivered all of this in the measured, concerned tone of a woman who believed she was being helpful. Simone stood at the kitchen counter with her palm flat on the cold marble and listened to every word. She thanked Gloria for calling. She set that phone down too. She was standing in the kitchen in the silence that followed when she saw the tablet on the counter. Marcus's tablet. The screen had lit up with a notification, a message preview from a contact saved under a name with a champagne bottle emoji beside it. The preview read 2 words, confirmed, coming. The sender's name was Deja. Simone read it once. She did not read it again. She reached out and turned the tablet face down on the marble counter with the careful deliberateness of someone who is trying not to break anything else in the room right now, because there is already enough broken. Then she pressed both palms flat on the counter and breathed. In through her nose, the way her father had taught her. Out through her mouth, slow. Her back was straight. Her face was still. The kitchen clock ticked. The morning moved. She walked to the front window and stood there and looked at the blocked driveway and watched the minutes advance toward the hour when her father would be lowered into the ground. And she understood, not with rage, not yet, not in a form that required immediate action, that she was watching herself miss it, one slow minute at a time. Wank in the home she shared with a man who had placed his car like a wall between her and the last goodbye she would ever get to give. She stayed at that window for a long time. She touched the bracelet. Her thumb found the engraving without looking. Still water runs deep. She thought about Celestine, the great-grandmother she had never met, who had worn this through things her father still talked around. She thought about her father's voice on the phone 3 weeks ago, already moving slower, but completely himself. Baby, when the time comes, and it will come because that's how time works, you will know exactly what to do. You always do. I made sure of it. She had told him not to talk like that. He had laughed his slow, rolling laugh. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them. She called her father's attorney, Bernard Calloway, who had worked alongside her father for 27 years and had a voice as settled as old timber. He had been expecting her call. He told her what she had known was coming for years, what her father had spent years preparing her for in pieces and impatience. He confirmed the full scope of the estate. He confirmed the reading the following morning. He confirmed that as of that day, she was sole heir to everything Solomon Tate had built across a lifetime. The number, the full number, across real estate and hospitality and energy and private equity and international holdings across 14 countries, was something most people would need to sit down to hear. Simone had known it for 2 years. Her father had shown it to her on a Tuesday afternoon in his study, with the same lack of ceremony with which he showed her everything important. Ever, the way he had first shown her a financial statement on the porch when she was 12. Just set it in front of her, trusted her to handle it, and waited. She had handled it. She always had. Bernard asked if she had questions. She said no. She thanked him. She ended the call. She set the phone on the windowsill beside her and looked at the blocked driveway and the morning beyond it. And something in her settled into a new configuration. Not a harder one, not a colder one, a clearer one. The particular clarity that comes when you have been patient long enough to see the complete shape of something you have been half seeing for years. She called a car service. She did not change her clothes. She walked out of the front door in her black dress, past Marcus's car sitting cold in the driveway, and she got into the car that came for her. And she carried her father's funeral program in both hands, and she did not look back at the house. She buried her father on a Friday morning in June, under a sky that was entirely too beautiful for the occasion. The kind of blue that makes everything beneath it look significant. 240 people attended the service at Friendship Baptist Church in Southwest Atlanta, which her father had attended for 30 years, and whose literacy program he had funded quietly for 20 of those 30 years without his name on anything. The choir sang his two favorite hymns. The pastor, who had known Solomon Tate since they were young men running in the same neighborhood, spoke for 25 minutes about a man who had built an empire and never once let the empire build him. Simone sat in the front row in her black dress with the funeral program on her lap and her hands folded over it and the bracelet on her wrist. She did not cry during the service. She had an arrangement with her grief. In public, she carried it. In private, she let it carry her. Her father had modeled this for her. She had learned it the way she learned everything from him, by watching, by absorbing, by understanding that discipline and feeling were not opposites. Marcus did not attend the funeral. She had not expected him to. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what Solomon Tate had built and how he had built it, and more importantly, how he had built his daughter. Solomon Tate had grown up in a neighborhood in Southwest Atlanta where ambition was not scarce, but resources were, which meant that the people who made it out tended to make it out on the specific fuel of knowing exactly what things cost because they had paid for everything themselves. He had worked construction at 18, logistics at 22, and by 27 had identified a gap in regional food distribution that nobody else had thought was worth the trouble. He spent 3 years in that gap before the trouble became profit. Then he identified another gap, then another. He had a gift, not for money exactly, but for systems, for seeing where a system was inefficient or absent and understanding what it would take to build a better one. He applied this gift for 40 years, across industries and across continents. Why? With the methodical patience of a man who had never been in a rush, because he had understood early that the people who rush are usually running from something, and he had decided at 27 that he would spend his life moving toward things instead. By the time Simone was born, Solomon was already comfortable. By the time she was 11 and received the bracelet on the porch, he was wealthy in a way that most people in their Atlanta neighborhood would not have guessed because Solomon Tate wore the same style of clothing he had always worn, and drove American cars, and ate at the same 3 restaurants he had always eaten at, and did not carry his net worth in any room he entered. The ones who act like they don't have it, he had told her once when she was older, and finally asking the right questions. Those are the ones you study, not because they're hiding, but because they've already done the thing that most people are still performing. They've separated what they have from who they are. That separation is the work. Most people never do it. He had raised Simone with precise intention. She attended public schools because he wanted her to know the full range of the world. She took the bus in college because he wanted her to know what it felt like to depend on infrastructure. She worked entry-level positions in 3 of his companies, under her mother's maiden name, Tate being set aside, for 4 years before he told her the full picture. In those 4 years, she answered phones, managed inventory, handled customer complaints, trained new hires, and was twice passed over for promotions by supervisors who did not know who she was and gave the positions to candidates who were, in both cases, less qualified. She handled both of those moments the way her father had taught her to handle things that were unfair but instructive. She absorbed them. She filed them. She kept moving. She never told anyone who she was. Not out of shame. Her father had been very specific about this distinction, had returned to it so many times it became a kind of family liturgy. There is a difference between concealment and restraint. Concealment is about fear. Restraint is about discernment. You don't owe everyone your whole story. You owe them your full presence. Those are different things. Simone had taken that distinction and made it the organizing principle of her life. And she was present everywhere she went, fully attentive, fully engaged, genuinely interested in people and their stories. She simply did not lead with her own. She let people find her at whatever depth they were willing to go. And she paid attention to how deep they went, because that told her everything about who they actually were. She had been managing Oaks, her father's flagship restaurant in Midtown Atlanta, for 3 years when Marcus Holt walked in on a Thursday evening. She had been running the front of house, not managing from a back office, but actually on the floor, learning the room the way her father had taught her to learn rooms, by being inside them. She knew the name of every server on that shift. She knew that table 12 needed a new candle because it had been burning for 4 hours and was getting low. She knew that the couple in the corner booth had been there for 2.5 hours and were on their third bottle of wine and would need a gentle navigation toward dessert or the check. She managed all of this without anyone watching her manage it, which was the point. Marcus came in with 3 colleagues, all of them in the easy, expensive clothing of men who had recently crossed a threshold of professional success and were still enjoying the crossing. He was charming in the way of someone who had practiced being charming and found that it worked consistently, which made the charm automatic, which made it harder to see as practiced. He was handsome. He listened to her that first evening with the focused attention of a man who was genuinely interested, asking questions about her, about the restaurant, about Atlanta, and not once asking about her family or her money or what she came from. She had found that disarming. She had read it at the time as substance, as a man who was interested in her and not in her adjacency to anything. Her father, when she told him about Marcus, had been quiet for a long moment on the phone. Then he had said, with the gentle indirection he used for his truest warnings, "A woman's quiet is either a mystery a man wants to solve or an invitation he wants to ignore. Pay attention to which one he does." She had laughed, told him she'd be fine. She had rubbed the bracelet without thinking about it. She had been right that Marcus was interested in her. She had been wrong, she would understand later, about the nature of the interest. He had been interested in the version of her that was visible, capable, composed, quietly confident, running a restaurant that was clearly excellent without any apparent effort. What he had never developed the patience for was the version of her that was not visible, the depth beneath the composure, the roots beneath the surface. He had looked at her stillness and eventually decided it was shallowness. He had looked at her restraint and decided it was limitation. He had looked at the measured way she moved through the world and decided she was moving that way because she didn't have more options. Gloria had helped him decide this. Gloria was the kind of woman who offered her real opinions only to her son and her mirror, but she offered them thoroughly. She had told Marcus, across 4 years of patient suggestion, that Simone was probably hiding something embarrassing about her background. It was that the restaurant she managed was likely propped up by someone and probably struggling. That Simone's quietness was not strength, but the particular stillness of a woman who knew she had married above herself and was being careful not to make a wrong move. Cole had heard all of it. He had been, by that point, already leaning. Deja had found him in the lean. Deja was strategic in the way of someone who had identified an opportunity and was working it with the patience of a professional. She had studied Marcus with the specific attention of a woman who understood that men with gaps in their confidence are more reachable than men who are whole. She had fed the gap slowly in pieces, agreeing with his frustrations about Simone, amplifying his suspicions about her family, while reflecting back to him the story he was already telling himself, that he was a man of potential who had been quietly underestimated by the woman who was supposed to see him most clearly. Simone had watched this from a careful distance. She had seen the phone go face down when she walked into rooms. She had felt the new quality of his silences, managed, monitored, nothing like the easy quiet of 2 people who know each other well. She had noticed the way he corrected her in public, Small corrections with small smiles that were designed to look like affection, but landed in her body like someone testing the ground beneath their feet. She had noticed all of it. She had said nothing. Not because she was afraid, and not because she was weak, and not because she didn't know what she was looking at. She had been quiet because she was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her that the measured response is the powerful one, that you do not spend energy on confirmation of things that are already clear, that you wait until you know the full shape of something before you decide what to do about it. The morning of the funeral, she had seen the full shape. It was a Saturday, 2 weeks after the funeral, when Simone walked into Oaks for the first time, not as its manager, but as its owner. She had always owned it, technically. Her father had placed it in her name 7 years ago, the same way he had placed several things in her name over the years, quietly, without ceremony, as a matter of preparation rather than gift. But she had managed it as though she were an employee, because her father had believed that ownership without stewardship was just a document, and she had believed it too. Today was different. Today she was walking in as the woman who had spent the past 2 weeks meeting with attorneys and accountants and board members and financial advisors across 4 cities, absorbing the full scope of what Solomon Tate had built and what it now meant for her to carry it. Today she walked in knowing not just the restaurant, but everything the restaurant sat inside of, the full architecture of a life's work. She arrived at 11:15 on a Saturday morning during brunch service. The restaurant was full, warm light, the smell of good food, the low, pleasant sound of a room full of people having a good time. She had overseen every detail of this space over 3 years of management: the weight of the silverware, the angle of the lighting, the music level, which dropped 2 notches at noon because she had noticed that people's conversations deepened around noon, and they needed less sound to fill the space. The flower arrangements refreshed every Tuesday with whatever was seasonal. She had interviewed every senior staff member personally and sat in every chair in the dining room to understand the room from every seat. The hostess looked up when she walked in and went immediately, professionally still. The floor manager, a man named Darius, who had worked with Simone for 3 years and understood her better than most people in her life, appeared from the back hallway within 30 seconds. His face was composed but tight with something he was managing carefully. Simone looked at him. "Is he here?" "Table 9, Darius said quietly. 20 minutes. She had not planned this. She had come in to check on the kitchen, to check on her staff, to be inside something that was hers and that her father had helped her build. Marcus being here was either coincidence or audacity, and she had learned enough about Marcus in 4 years to know which one it was. She walked to the manager's station. She reviewed the reservation log. She asked Darius to bring the chair from her office, the high-backed one she kept for long meetings, the one that sat 6 inches higher than standard chairs and had a particular quality of presence when it was in a room. He brought it without a word. She placed it herself at the head of the corridor that opened onto the full dining floor, positioned so that anyone in the room who looked up would see her first. She sat down, crossed her legs, folded her hands. She looked at table 9. Marcus was leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man who had decided the room belonged to him. One arm on the armrest, long legs stretched out, filling his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man on comfortable ground. Deja sat across from him in a yellow wrap dress, a champagne flute between 2 fingers, saying something that was making him smile with the openness he had stopped showing Simone somewhere around year 2. They looked like people who had arranged themselves in the belief that they were the most interesting thing in any room they entered. It took 4 minutes for Marcus to feel it, not to see it, to feel it. The particular shift in the quality of a room when something has changed and the room knows it before the people inside it do. He scanned the floor the way people scan rooms when they are searching for the source of a feeling. His eyes moved across the tables, across the servers, and then landed on the woman sitting at the head of the corridor in the high-backed chair, wearing the black dress she had put on for her father's funeral 2 weeks ago and had apparently not felt the need to change from. Every piece of easy left his face at once. His arm came off the armrest. The champagne flute stopped halfway to his mouth. His whole body arrested in the middle of a gesture, or caught between the momentum of the moment he had been in and the reality of the one he had just entered. He set the glass down slowly. Deja followed his eyes. Her smile dissolved the way a sophisticated construction dissolves. Not all at once, but in stages, each piece of the confidence leaving separately as she read the room. As she understood that the staff was oriented toward the woman in the black chair in a way that had nothing to do with service. As she understood that the floor manager who had just appeared 2 steps behind that woman was not standing there to take an order. As she understood that the woman in the chair owned the room they were sitting in, literally owned it in every sense that the word owns. Marcus crossed the dining floor toward her with the measured stride of a man constructing a story while he walks. Simone watched him come. She watched the working version of composure assembling itself on his face, the slight readjustment of his shoulders, the decision to hold eye contact, the gathering of whatever he had prepared to say. She had watched him construct himself for 4 years. She knew the architecture of it. She knew where the load-bearing walls were, and she knew which parts were decorative. She spoke before he reached her. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at Deja. She looked at Marcus and she said, plainly and without decoration, that she had missed her father's funeral 2 weeks ago. She said she had stood at the window of the house they shared and watched the minutes move past the hour when her father was being buried while his car sat in the driveway. She said she knew that it had not been an accident. She said she would not be coming home. Each sentence had space around it. She delivered them the way her father had always delivered important things, without rush, without performance, trusting the words to carry what they needed to carry without additional weight. Marcus opened his mouth. She could see the pivot forming, the pivot toward explanation, toward context, toward the version of the story that would cast what he had done as something other than what it was. She had heard many of his pivots over 4 years. They were skilled. He was a man who was good with language in the specific way of someone who had learned that the right framing could make almost any behavior survivable. Simone, I'm not asking for an explanation, she said. Her voice was even, not cold, even. I'm giving you information. She looked past him then, for the first time, at Deja. She looked at her the way you look at something that has cost you something and no longer has the power to cost you more. Not with anger, not with performance, just clearly, with the full attention of a woman who was done editing her own vision to make someone else more comfortable. She said that the tab would be charged to Marcus's card. She said, please finish your meal. Then she stood, smoothed the front of her black dress, and walked through the corridor toward the back. She did not look back. Behind her, Marcus stood in the middle of the dining floor. The room moved around him, servers on their routes, guests in their conversations. Darius managing the floor with the practiced invisibility of a good manager. The room had already returned to itself. It had its own momentum, its own life. And that life had nothing to do with the man standing in the center of it, with his champagne going flat at table 9, and a woman in yellow behind him who had stopped being interested in him approximately 4 minutes ago. He stood there longer than he meant to. His hands hung at his sides open, because there was nothing to reach for and nothing that reaching would accomplish. He looked eventually at the framed photograph on the wall near the service bar. He had walked past this photograph many times in 4 years of coming to this restaurant. Dozens of brunches, a handful of dinners, a birthday party once. He had glanced at it the way you glance at restaurant art. He had never actually looked at it. He looked at it now. A broad-shouldered black man in his early 60s, in a blue linen shirt, and with the kind of smile that started in the eyes. Standing beside a younger version of Simone in front of this exact entrance on what was clearly an opening night. Champagne, a ribbon, the unmistakable quality of a beginning. The older man had one hand on Simone's shoulder and the other raised in the direction of the camera, and the expression on his face was not pride exactly, though pride was in it. It was something more specific. It was the expression of a man who has handed something precious to the person he trusts most and is watching to see how they carry it. Solomon Tate, founder, Oaks Restaurant Group, January 14th, 2017. Marcus read the name on the small plaque beneath the frame. Then he read it again. He had heard the name Solomon Tate, and he had heard it in the way that names of a certain magnitude are heard even by people who are not paying specific attention. In business sections of newspapers, in conversations at the kinds of events he attended, because attending them was part of how he maintained a professional image. He had heard the name the way you hear a reference point. He had never connected it to the woman who came home tired from managing a restaurant and made tea and sat at the kitchen table and read with her legs tucked under her. He stood at that photograph for a long time. He thought about the blocked driveway. He had parked there deliberately. He had done it at 2 in the morning, coming home briefly before leaving again, and he had stood in the dark driveway and looked at her car and made the calculation. He had made it with the cold logic of a man who had decided that whatever consequences arrived, he would manage them. He was good at managing consequences. He had been managing them his entire adult life, building a version of himself that was always slightly ahead of whatever was actually true about him. And it had worked consistently until the morning the version of himself he had constructed met the full reality of the woman he had constructed it next to. He had looked at Simone for 4 years and seen a capable, quiet woman who managed someone else's restaurant and came from a family she never talked about. He had looked and never looked hard enough to ask the question that would have changed what he saw. He had measured her against the story he had already written, and when she didn't fill it the way he wanted, he had decided the deficiency was in her. He left Oaks without finishing his meal. He left Deja at the table, which he handled with the dignity of someone who had already recalibrated and was looking across the room at a man at another table who did not have a complicated history. He walked to his car and sat in it in the parking deck and called his mother. Gloria answered on the second ring. He told her what had happened. He told her what he had learned. He told her the name on the photograph, the name Bernard Calloway had mentioned when he'd read the news headline 2 days later that had made Marcus sit down in the middle of his living room and stay sitting for a long time. He told her the number. The silence that followed was not the silence of a woman who was shocked. It was the silence of a woman who was recalculating. You could hear the machinery of it. And when Gloria spoke again, her voice had changed in the specific way voices change when they have discovered that their certainty was wrong in a direction that costs them something. She asked carefully, gently, with none of the clipped precision she had used when she called Simone the morning of the funeral, whether there was any chance of repairing things. Whether Simone was the forgiving kind. Marcus held the phone and said nothing for a moment. He heard what his mother was doing. He heard it completely, perhaps for the first time, the way you hear a mechanism only after it has stopped working the way it was supposed to. "No, Mama," he said. "I don't think she is." He was wrong about that, but he would not find out for a long time. The weeks that followed were quiet in the specific way of consequences that don't announce themselves. Deja became unreachable with the efficient speed of a woman who had identified that a particular season had ended and had no interest in performing an ending that the facts had already produced. A mutual acquaintance mentioned, without particular investment, that she had been seen with someone else. Marcus nodded. He had expected it. He had been useful to her in one context, and the context had changed, and she had moved on with the clean practicality of someone who had never been in it for anything other than the context. His professional life began to feel different at its edges. He had 2 business relationships that he had maintained partly through the easy warmth that came from his association with Oaks, an association he had not examined the source of, quietly dissolved, not dramatically, not with confrontation or explanation, with the gentle professional language of people who have become busy in other directions. Emails took longer to be returned. A partnership conversation that had been moving steadily forward found new complications. A meeting that had been easy to schedule became difficult. He understood what was happening. There was no one to call about it because nothing had been done to him directly. He was simply being held at a different temperature. The rooms that had been warm were cooler. The relationships that had been easy required more maintenance. He was being asked to carry more of his own weight, which turned out to be more than he had understood, because for 4 years he had been leaning on something without knowing he was leaning. He was not destroyed. That was not what happened. He was a competent man in his field, skilled enough to operate without the invisible advantage he had not known he had. He would be fine. He would manage, which was what Marcus Holt did, consistently and well. But managing was different from thriving, and thriving was different from standing next to someone who carried something extraordinary and finally understanding what you were standing next to. That understanding arrived in the form of a question he could not answer, which was how he had missed it. to how he had sat at those brunch tables and slept in that house and looked at that woman across the kitchen table for 4 years and never once asked the question that would have required him to look harder than the surface. The answer, when he was honest with himself in the early mornings, when honesty was unavoidable, was that he had looked at Simone and seen a reflection of what he had already decided, and anything she did that didn't fit the decision, he had simply moved around or reclassified or asked his mother to help him explain away. He had been looking at something extraordinary and calling it ordinary because it was quiet. He thought about this more than he expected to. 60 days after she walked out of Oaks and into the beginning of the next chapter of her life, Simone was on the terrace. Her father had left it to her in a separate arrangement. A property outside Atlanta on a rise of land that opened into green and sky. The kind of place that felt like it had been waiting for a particular quality of human use and had finally found it. She had known about it for years. She had visited it alone a handful of times, always with the feeling of a woman who is not yet ready to live inside something, but needs to know it is there. Now she was ready. The morning was early. The light was doing what good morning light does on high land, coming in at an angle that turned everything warm, making the air itself feel like something that was on your side. She was sitting with a cup of tea, both hands around the mug, no phone on the table beside her, no meetings for another hour. Just the morning and the light and the green of the land rolling out below the terrace, and a bird somewhere doing something unhurried. She looked down at her left wrist. The bracelet was there. It was always there. She turned it slowly, her thumb finding the engraving the way it had found it 10,000 times over 26 years. Still water runs deep. She felt the words beneath her thumb, worn smooth at the edges, but still there, still legible in the language of touch. She thought about her father. She let herself do it fully this time. Not managed, not contained, not pressed into the shape of something a woman could carry in public. She let it be large. She thought about his hands, which were always calm, which were the most settled hands she had ever seen, the hands of a man who had arrived somewhere and saw no reason to scramble. She thought about the porch in Atlanta and the summer light and the cool weight of the bracelet settling against her 11-year-old wrist and the specific feeling of being seen accurately by someone who loved you enough to prepare you instead of protect you. She thought about what he had told her on the phone, the last real conversation, 3 weeks before he died, his voice moving slower, but completely himself. "I'm not worried about you, baby. I've never been worried about you. You're the one in the family with the quietest strength. Celestine would have known exactly what to do with you. She had told him she loved him. He had said he loved her more. She had said, no, impossible." He had laughed his slow rolling laugh. She sat with the memory of it. She let it be what it was. Grief and gratitude in the same vessel, and which is what love becomes when the person is gone. This complicated, beautiful weight that is simultaneously the hardest thing and the truest thing you carry. She thought about Marcus, not with bitterness. Bitterness was a thing that kept you standing in someone else's story, kept you organizing your present around someone else's failure. And Simone had too much work ahead of her to spend energy standing anywhere she wasn't meant to be. She thought about him the way you think about a season that taught you something clearly and then ended, which is what it was. He had taught her things. He had taught her the difference between a man who was interested in a woman and a man who was interested in his idea of a woman. He had taught her that the people who are most threatened by what they cannot measure are not equipped to carry what cannot be measured. He had taught her in the most concrete possible way what her father had always meant when he said that a man who loves your peace will never disturb it. She had not let him disturb her peace in the end. She had let him reveal himself. There was a difference. She had always understood that difference, in the same way she understood the difference between concealment and restraint, between strength and performance, between wealth as identity and wealth as responsibility. These were the things her father had spent her entire childhood planting in her carefully, one piece at a time, with more patience than most people could maintain. She touched the bracelet. Still water runs deep. It was her father's voice she heard when she felt those words. She heard him saying it on the porch, saying it in the way he said everything that mattered, simply without flourish, trusting the idea to carry itself. She heard him saying it, and she understood it now in a way she had not understood it at 11, or at 20, or even at 30. She understood it now as the description of a life, not a tactic, not a piece of advice, a life, the still ones, the quiet ones, the ones who do not need the room to know what they are. They are not empty. They are not humble in the diminished sense of the word. They are deep, and deep means there is more beneath the surface than the surface suggests. Deep means the roots go down further than anyone looking at the tree from outside would think to measure. Knots deep means that when the storm arrives, and it always arrives in some form, from some direction, sometimes from the person who was supposed to be standing beside you, the tree bends. The tree absorbs. The tree does not perform its survival. It simply survives because the roots were laid down long before the storm, in all those quiet seasons when nobody was watching. Her father had laid her roots. 37 years of patient, deliberate planting, the porch conversations, the financial statements, the entry-level jobs under her mother's name, the bracelet, the long phone calls from her car after the hard evenings. Every piece of it, every seemingly small thing, had been a root. She could feel them now, not as a metaphor, but as an actual structural reality. Simone is the thing that had held her on the mornings she stood at the front window watching her blocked driveway, as the thing that had allowed her to walk into Oaks that Saturday and sit in that chair with her hands folded and speak 4 clean sentences to a man who had counted on her not being able to. The roots had held. The bird in the distance was still doing its unhurried thing. The light was fully gold now, the early angle giving way to the settled warmth of 9 o'clock. Below the terrace, the land ran green to the tree line, and the tree line ran up to the sky, and the sky was the same impossible blue it had been on the morning of her father's funeral. She thought, I'm going to be all right. Not as a reassurance, not as something she needed to tell herself, as a recognition of something that was already true and had been true for a long time, that had been built into her by a man with calm hands on a porch in Atlanta before she was old enough to understand what he was doing. She drank her tea. She let the morning be the morning. In 2 hours, she had a call with the board of Solomon Tate's hospitality group, her hospitality group now, a fact she was still making room for in the way you make room for things that are enormous and true. Next week, she was flying to London for meetings that would take 3 days. The week after, Johannesburg. The work was staggering in its scope, and she was not unaware of how much she did not yet know, and how much she would need to learn, and how many ways she would need to be in the years ahead, more than she had ever been asked to be before. She was not afraid of it. Her father had made sure she wouldn't be. One quiet morning at a time, for 37 years, with his slow rolling laugh and his calm hands and a thin gold bracelet that had come from a woman named Celestine, who had survived things that were still too heavy to name directly, and who had worn the bracelet through all of it without breaking, and who had passed it down through the family to the one with the quietest strength. Simone turned the bracelet on her wrist one more time, felt the engraving, smiled. Small, private, real, belonging entirely to her, requiring no audience. Still water runs deep. She breathed in. She breathed out. She was ready.